Okay, I think we have all systems go here today, so let me just see here. I think I'm trying to get better at this. My video skills seem to be regressing as we go through the semester. But anyway, so we've made it to lecture 22, and it looks like we're going to make it to the Thanksgiving holiday, so hopefully what we have here is kind of a lecture that maybe is a little bit more fun and enjoyable and all that stuff, a little bit lighter in parts. Anyways. So just to remind you, I believe that it looks like we have, including today, 5 more classes. So I think that's, I have all the data there correct. The last class is Thursday, December 12th. The final exam, of course, is the 19th, a week later. The times are a little different than the class times, just to remind you how all that works. But of course, we'll be doing things about the same way in this class that we've done them 2 times before, meaning we'll have a practice exam and all that stuff. The last day of class, we'll of course do the comprehensive review and all of that. People keep asking me, the exam is not cumulative, right? Just since whatever we've done since the last exam, which is going to be basically macroeconomics, and maybe a couple special topics. One other thing, I know I have a lot of emails about various exam matters and how am I doing sorts of things. I'm sifting through them, and I will, of course, answer yours as soon as I possibly can. So if you fall into that category, please sit tight for a moment. Okay, I guess, one other thing I wanted to mention is that we do have another chapter up there. I think it's chapter 19, which is a little bit on macroeconomic theory. This is in the readings or the textbook folder on Top Hat. And there is one homework there to be followed by another fairly shortly. Okay, I think I got everything there. So yeah, last time we've, basically up until now, we've been talking a lot about these aggregate variables. The theory, I guess, and practice of computing them. And we, I guess, kind of, if you want to think about the basic facts that are falling into place here for us, facts, by the way, that we're going to start thinking about from a theoretical perspective, we have this idea that inflation is bad. I don't know if I have to emphasize that, but it's not immediately obvious that just changing the unit of measurement effectively, right, in our case, that's kind of what we're doing, is a bad thing, but most of us have a sense that when prices are changing a lot, when they're growing rapidly, that's not a good thing. By the same token, we have this idea that economic growth, right, that is to say, increasing GDP is good, and last time we bridged or developed a bridge between GDP per capita and unemployment, right, which is a directly measurable thing that we liken to good economic performance. Right? In particular, we can kind of think about it this way: when our economy, right, is functioning at a level in which unemployment is as low as it can practically be, well, then it's functioning at its potential. And so if I wanted to kind of think about all of this, what we're going to try to do is maintain our economy at potential, right, while at the same time not having inflation. Right? You can think about that in one of 2 ways. That can be cast as our goal as macroeconomists, right, to manage the economy in such a way so that we have low inflation and unemployment close to its natural level. And you can kind of think about that as our policy objective, or as just a yardstick, sort of a 2-dimensional yardstick by which we think about economic performance in general. So the trade-off that's going to emerge as we develop our theory is that oftentimes higher economic growth or low unemployment, I want to think about those 2 things at the same time, will often involve more inflation. Now notice I snuck that word often in there. That's because not always, right, is that the case. In fact, it's very good if we can get high growth and low inflation, right? And it's not so great if we have low growth, that is to say high unemployment, and inflation at the same time, which unfortunately has happened in our recent economic history. So just to remind you how all these things work, I feel like I kind of went past this diagram a little bit too quickly. I'm going to go to the slideshow here. I don't think just to make it a little bit clearer here. I went through it a little bit quickly. In particular, I don't think I discussed what this bottom diagram is capturing as much as we might like. So up there we have the unemployment rate. One thing I'll remind you of is, so we have the red areas where unemployment is kind of above the natural rate, right? And then the blue areas where we're a little bit below, but then you can see that the yardstick there is that black line, which tracks the natural rate of unemployment. Down here what we have is the output gap, right? Well, what is that? That describes for us the relationship between potential GDP, what we could be producing, right, if we were at full employment, right? That is to say zero unemployment, or practical unemployment, I should say, at the natural rate of unemployment. And then it describes for us, you can think about this as the counterfactual. When unemployment is really high, we're working below our potential, and this measures how far from the potential output we are, just with zero as kind of being right where we want to be, right? And so this output gap is another way of talking about how how unemployment, economic performance, and economic performance interrelate, right? So it's kind of a couple of different ways of thinking about when we're at our target, when we're below it, how do we measure recessions? But what I'm trying to stress for you is that these things kind of go together. Potential GDP, output being where we want it, unemployment at its natural rate, things like that. Okay. And of course, you can see that these things are more or less mirror images of one another, and the recessions, of course, are put in there just as we would expect. Of course, the other thing we're going to try to do, those variables are more or less directly related. The thing we're going to try to figure out here, or model out, is the relationship between prices and economic performance. And so you might kind of think about it as this is our two variable problem here, building a theory that lets us explain how prices work, right? Inflation, that is to say, and how unemployment works, right? And what is the relationship between the two? I mean, you can kind of look at this diagram, very casual observation, and just say, well, I see some spiky things are up on the top and down on the bottom at roughly the same times, but that's not always the case, right? If you're just trying to correlate these things visually. So that's kind of what we're going to try to do, is build a theory that puts these two things together, right? And of course, one thing that's not on the picture here is I know something that I have to keep saying this because I know students love to talk about this stuff, stock markets and rates of return and interest rates and all of that stuff, right? Financials, I guess, aren't on this picture either. And we're going to get into that as we move along. So before we start modeling all this stuff out, I thought it would be good to just spend a little bit of time thinking about the history of how these problems work. And in so doing, we'll also be able to discuss one theory that will actually help us later on once we've gotten all of our details of our model laid out. So you might say that macroeconomics as a discipline really started to come of age at around the same time that we first had these countries, right? We first had countries that were these national actors in some overarching sense, right? And so this was really what I'm thinking of as kind of the age of exploration, what you might call the mercantilist era. This was coming out of the Dark Ages into the Renaissance, where we had England and France and things that we can think of as countries. And they encountered one of their first macro problems in the form of inflow of gold, right? So this is, you think about it this way, this is the first time people started thinking about currency and overall economic activity together, right, as two sides of the same coin. And so the very simplest question was, were basically about gold, and the relationship that the quantity of gold out there, right, in the economy in general, what relationship that had to economic performance. So along with this came a lot of thoughts that we've already discussed in this class, right? This idea that wealth, right, national wealth and gold were different things, right? That is to say, the wealth of, say, England wasn't just how much gold was within England. It had to do with what England could actually produce, right, over a given period of time. And the other thing that sort of became clear, I'm thinking of Spain here mainly, because Spain had this massive inflow of gold from the New World, was that the value of this gold fluctuated, right? This currency. So what does that mean? It means that depending on how much gold was out there, well, the price level changed a little bit, or changed maybe not a little bit, but quite a bit, right? And so this is one way of saying this, is that the value of gold, what you can buy with it, right, ultimately its value, was bouncing around a lot. And people began to notice, well, when there's a lot of gold out there, it seems like everything gets more expensive, right? Or put another way, what my gold can buy, its value is lower. And so people wondered about this quite a bit. And of course, there was this idea, one of the, I guess, doctrines of mercantilist economics was that you wanted to try to keep all of your gold in your country and not have it go to some other country, right? Your competitor would then have gold to, I guess, raise an army, I don't know. So one of the early theories that came out of all of this was put together by this fellow by the name of David Hume. Anybody know the name David Hume? David Hume? Pretty important philosopher, right? He's mainly known as a philosopher and not as an economist, but he did a little bit of thinking about some economic matters, and he developed this thing called the price specie flow mechanism. Was something like an economic theory of how gold flows and economic activity related. Right? In particular, his was a theory that suggested, these policies that countries were pursuing to try to keep gold from going overseas, right, were self-defeating. And so it kind of works like this, right? Like if you and of course there was this related mercantilist policy where what you were trying to do was have a trade surplus with everyone, right? What that meant was you're trying to export all of your products overseas and not import anything. So if you're England, you're like, here, buy all our wood, buy our wheat that we're growing, please buy it all, France. And meanwhile, we're going to try to buy nothing from you, and that'll be good because then we'll pile up gold by selling you stuff, and gold that we're not spending. So gold comes in and doesn't go out. So what Hume pointed out was this policy might be self-defeating, right? He said, well, let's see, if we try to export more than we import, maybe gold will pile up in our country. That'll be good. But then what'll happen is there will be inflation, right, within England's borders. Things will get more expensive here because the supply of gold is going up, right? Well, when that happens, now suddenly people want to buy things overseas because our English prices are higher than prices in France, right, because gold is piling up here. When that happens, what we want to do is spend our money on foreign products, and that results in this outflow of gold, right? So you can see here, the idea, if you don't have to understand all of those steps, it's pretty complicated. But the idea is that you understand that prices and economic activity are kind of moving in a direction, right, in a way that depends upon this supply of gold available. So there's lots of interesting things about this, right? This relationship that's developed between prices and overall economic activity, equilibration. There's a lot of little components to this. So this has often been described a little bit later, but you can see and all kinds of writers had sort of the germ of this idea in place. This led to this thing called the quantity theory of money, which is a idea, right, of thinking, or a way of thinking about how currency flows through the economy, how it's influenced by economic activity, right? How these flows depend upon economic activity, and what this means for the price level, right? The price level. So how do these things relate? It's interesting that, right, so really the basic idea, I'll show you how it works in a second, is that prices adjust to the level of economic activity in a way that takes into account the amount of money in circulation, right? And believe it or not, these basic variables are some of the variables that our policymakers work with today, right? Just the quantity of money in circulation. Maybe you've even got a hint of this, when we talk about the Federal Reserve and easy money and all that stuff. This is not too distant from what we'll discuss here. So, it actually is very much like a pressure theory of money, and many of you probably, maybe I'm giving you PTSD here by bringing up chemistry, right? When you take chemistry, you learn this thing called the ideal gas law, right? And it's just this relationship between temperature, pressure, and volume, right? And the idea is that if you take a gas that's in a fixed volume, I shouldn't be trying this, but I'm going to. And then you change the temperature. Well, what happens is you excite the molecules in whatever chamber you're talking about, and they have to move around a lot faster, right? And so this is kind of the pressure, volume, temperature thing here. So I have all this here. This constant, is that the molar constant? Is that what you call that? What is it?
The N is the number of moles.
Yeah, I used to have all those things. Yeah, the number of moles. Oh, good. Yeah. So I used to have all of these things memorized, but not so much anymore. Okay, so the quantity theory of money basically starts with this idea that M times V is equal to P times T, right? And so on the left we have the money supply and its velocity, right? Well, I'll tell you what that is in a second. And that depends upon the price level and the number of transactions that people want to take, right? So the idea is that money has to kind of zoom around the economy to facilitate all of the things that people want to buy and sell, right? So I have a simple example here with a hunter and a farmer, and I don't know why, you don't really need to have two goods, but I'm trying to approximate this idea that, some people provide, you provide goods and you trade them for other goods in this sense, but usually money is the go-between by which you do this. So in my simple example here, I have a hunter with 4 rabbits this hunter wants to sell those rabbits and wants to buy 4 bushels of wheat. Meanwhile, there's some farmer out there who has 4 bushels of wheat and wants to buy 4 rabbits. So we have something like a balanced circular flow here, right, among these people in our economy. And so if you think about it this way, what the hunter wants to do is sell 4 rabbits. What the farmer wants to do is sell 4 bushels. Of course, each sale has a buyer. And if you add up these 4 transfers of rabbits and these 4 transfers of wheat bushels, you wind up with 8 total transactions that want to happen here, right, across the economy. Okay, well, let's suppose that the price of a rabbit is $1 while the price of wheat is $1. It just kind of makes it work out nicely, if we kind of assume that. And then we can imagine that there's some amount of money in the economy, currency out there in the economy, which I've taken to be $2 here initially, right? So they have $2 of 2 gold coins maybe, each worth $1, I guess, or $2, of money, if you want to think about it that way. And the question then becomes, how often does this dollar need to change hands to finance all of these transactions? Right? You might sort of pose it that way. And thinking about what this means, it would mean something like the velocity. How frequently does the money change hands to finance the transactions in the economy, right? So if the farmer starts off with $2, right, well, you can think about it this way. The farmer can buy 2 rabbits, right, each at $1 a piece. So the farmer says, here you go, hunter. I'll give you $2 for those 2 rabbits. The hunter says, thank you very much. Oh, farmer, may I buy 2 bushels of wheat from you? Oh, here's $2, right? Works out nicely. And then the farmer says, okay, yes, now that you've bought some wheat and I've bought some rabbits, let's do it again. I'll buy 2 more rabbits. Oh, I'll buy 2 more wheat. And then we're all done, right? So you can see here that what's happened is that our if we use the equation up there, we have I got it kind of reversed here, so this is P times T, 8 times 1, 8 transactions times the price, right, of each item being sold. Well, we have $2 here as our money supply, and then V we could calculate out as the velocity. You can see it would just turn out to be 4. So the typical dollar has changed hands 4 times in this example, right? And you can even see how that works. When I did I gave you $2, you gave me $2, then I gave you $2, and you gave me $2, right? That was 4 total trades. Now, what's interesting here is if we only have $1, right, the same exact, we can still complete all of our transactions, but what's going to have to happen with that dollar? It's going to have to move a lot faster, right? Now the farmer goes to the farmer, I guess I start with the farmer, goes to the hunter and says, I'll buy a rabbit, right, with the $1. And then the hunter says, okay, I'll buy a bushel. Now the farmer says, okay, I'll buy another rabbit. I'll buy another bushel. I'll buy another rabbit. I'll buy another bushel. Now that $1 has to change hands. Well, if we use the math or our logic, you can see it has to change hands 8 times. So there's this relationship between the velocity of money, how fast it turns hands, and prices, right? And also the supply of money. So there's actually a neat little illustration here. I didn't see if this works ahead of time. Oh, sorry. So this is, if you don't know what this is, does anybody know what this is, by the way? Yes? Who are these characters?
Beavis and Butthead.
These are Beavis and Butthead. It's funny how often I refer to the creator, Mike Judge, I guess, of Beavis and Butthead. So he also made that movie Idiocracy, if anybody is looking for a great movie to watch. And he also made the movie Office Space, which is another classic. That's a good one. Anyway, so these were 2 characters who were on MTV. I wonder if people even know what MTV is these days, but and this is one illustration of the velocity of money here that came up on their show. So you can see here, this is the heading of the clip. So let's just watch it here. It's kind of fun.
Our school's making us sell candy? Yeah. We're losers.
What in the hell kind of sales approach is that? You boys couldn't sell $1 for 50 cents.
They're $2, sir.
Yeah, don't try to rip us off. Work what?
Well, I've only got $2.
Buy one from me.
No, wait, buy one for me. Get out of the way.
I'll sell mine for half price, sir.
Half price? Well, now you're talking. Here, why don't I take one from each of you? Now, you boys better start charging full price. I'm sure your school can't afford to lose money.
Selling stuff sucks.
Yeah. Hey, Beavis, I'll buy one of your candy bars for $1.
No way. They're $2. Whoa.
Then can you, loan me $1?
No way, because then you'll have $2 and I won't have any.
Come on, Beavis, I'll buy one from you. That way you'll sell a candy bar, plus you'll have $2.
Man. Okay, cool. Yeah. Let me have some, come on.
No way. I'll sell you one for $2.
Okay.
This town sucks. We're never gonna sell any candy.
Hey, Butter, you didn't try one of these. They got peanuts. It's really good.
Oh, yeah? Cool. Hey, Beavis, wanna buy a candy bar from me?
I think you get the idea, right? You can see that the candy bars are changing hands frequently enough to, or just in frequency that depends upon the price of a candy bar and the amount of money they have, right? So you could calculate the velocity of money for the Beavis and Butthead economy without too much troubles there. Anyways, in terms of its modern statement, we often think about the quantity of money, rather than thinking about the number of transactions, we think about a very good proxy for the number of transactions, and that is typically real income, right? So, in fact, it's a pretty good, if you think about the way we reasoned out real income, we think about it as the product of this circular flow, where people get income and then they spend it on the goods that they create. It's kind of a nice way of proxying the total amount of transactions that you want in an economy. So we kind of start with that idea that T, right, the transactions, is something proportional to real income. The other idea that we put in place is this idea that generically V wants to be constant. I'll put it that way. So what does that mean? The velocity of money turns over at kind of a given rate. right? And so think about it this way. You go shopping once a week for groceries maybe. You get paid every 2 weeks. The money kind of comes in and goes out according to the rhythm of your life, right? The way you bank and all those things. So that kind of dictates how fast money changes hands, right? For example, you wouldn't, my farmer and my hunter wouldn't, run back and forth faster to trade rabbits and wheat if they, under those circumstances. What they would typically do is they would, just kind of buy one a day or something, right? Just the way they live their lives kind of determines velocity. So we start with that idea that V is relatively constant, and also that income is proportional to transactions. Well, then you can kind of say, well, the price level depends upon that, all this stuff on the left-hand, right-hand side, the amount of money we have in circulation, its velocity, and then we divide it by the level of income, right? At least in the way I've written it there. So why do I point this out? Well, this gives us a theory that at least says something about how prices, currency, and income are interrelated, right? In particular, it says, well, let's see, if we increase the money supply, prices should go up, right? If we increase income, prices should go down. And those are both kind of phenomena that we've observed, right? Even just the little stuff we said about hyperinflations last time, the little bit we talked about those, when the government prints a lot of money, prices tend to go up, right? It's one source of inflation. By the same token, when incomes go up, we would expect prices to go down. That's less familiar. Now, oftentimes we flip this around in the modern statement and we write it like that, M is equal to KPY. And I'll just say it quickly here without trying to fully explain it. That's often thought of or cast as a theory of money demand. Money demand, that's a weird idea, right? What that says is something about how much cash you need to have, right? You want to hold on hand. Leave that aside and we'll just look at this first equation here. Deflation is not something that happens all that commonly. Now it just turns out that the Great Depression was a time period in which we had some deflation. There's actually a worldwide period going roughly 1870 to 1890, I guess, coinciding maybe with the Progressive era in the United States, right? That period of time when the United States was expanding rapidly westward. We had railroads, we had all these things. Well, the Great Deflation was, I guess, a phenomena that was important in the United States and worldwide. What happened was, over this period of time, productivity was booming for all these reasons, right? You think about the United States, all that new land coming into agriculture, railroads, right? New machinery, all of these things, productivity was just booming, right? This would mean in our equation there that Y was getting larger and larger and larger, right? Well, at the same time, the world's gold supply, while increasing, wasn't increasing enough, right? So if you sort of run that through the equation there, you can see what happens. As Y goes up and M goes up at a lower rate, prices start going down. And this created deflation, right? And that's why we call this the Great Deflation. It's like the money supply, in terms of the world's gold supply, wasn't large enough to keep prices up, so they started going down. Now, in the United States, this Great Deflation had a very strong regional character, had a very strong regional feel to it, right? This had to do with two things, right? One of which was that the northeastern banking sector, or the banking sector in the United States at the time, was heavily concentrated in the Northeast, New York, right? So even like J.P. Morgan, of course, we all know about that, and Chase and all that stuff. Just like, I guess now, so it was then. So you had northeastern banking industries, and then you had manufacturing was kind of in the near Midwest, farming was out, further in the Midwest, and so you had like all these people who were doing the producing, right, borrowing the money to build their new investments and everything, buy their farmland, whatever, from the Northeast. Typically you use a loan to do that, right? Now, if you take out a loan and then there's deflation, you're not so psyched about that, right? Because in some sense what you've done is you've borrowed dollars, right? And then those dollars that you borrowed, well, they're worth a lot less, right, than the ones you're trying to pay back, right? Just like when inflation happens, the value of a dollar goes down. When deflation happens, the value goes up. So you can imagine that people were pretty upset about all of this in the United States, or particularly those people who are in the, not in the Northeast. I guess if you're a lender, you're pretty excited about this. All that money coming in, paying back the loans, is actually more valuable than the money you lent out. Okay. So I'm guessing this slide was somewhat unexpected. There's a little bit of a controversy that's developed over time in economics, and it has to do with the whole series of political events that came out of this deflation and the so-called Coinage Act of 1873, which was this period essentially said that you could no longer trade your dollars for silver, right? That silver would no longer be accepted as a currency that could be exchanged for dollars. So back in those days, that's the way the dollar worked, right? Ultimately, what it was it was a right for you to claim a certain amount of some precious metal from the bank, right? So in principle, you could take your dollar to the bank and you could get the amount of gold commensurate with that, or silver, and the bank could pay you with silver or gold, and that would be kind of what your dollar actually meant, right? It went back to some precious metal. Well, in the Coinage Act of 1873, it said, we're just going to go from gold going forward here. And, this coupled with deflation, this, I guess you could say, contributed to the deflation because the supply of gold is relatively fixed, right? And especially when you take fewer metals, when you have a lower stock of metal that you'll accept, well, then suddenly you're very much beholden to the amount of metal that's in circulation, right? So you can think about it this way. This put a limit on M, right, in my equation here. And then Y started to grow and prices started to go down, and this is where the controversy is here. So these characters here, right, are, of course, I hope you recognize them from The Wizard of Oz. I was actually going to start to, segue or sort of phase this part of the lecture out, but it so happens that every so often, there's some new Wizard of Oz movie or show that comes along. So, a couple years ago we had Wicked, right, which was, I guess, a prequel to The Wizard of Oz, right? And now we have the movie Wicked coming out. So, I figure that'll carry me through another, 5 or 10 years of lectures. This is, of course, the original Wizard of Oz. How many people have seen The Wizard of Oz? You know the story? Oh, that's pretty good. By the way, I'm sort of wondering about this. I observed on my way to class today, I was just kind of looking at my phone, and I was like, I wonder if this is in the public domain, right? It turns out that the book, right, all the books, the Wizard of Oz books, are actually in the public domain, right? So if you wanted to write some fan literature and sell it, you could, right? You could make up your own Wizard of Oz stories with the characters and all that. You can't quite yet use the images for profit, because the movie is not in the public domain, right? And this is from the movie. Of course, this is fair use because I'm using it for educational purposes here. But those are the characters. Did I ask people seen the movie or just knew the story? Have people? I asked about. Okay, so that's fun. It's a fun movie, a great musical, and I get the song stuck in my head every time I look at this. If I only had a brain, that song. I don't know why that's the one that pops into my mind. Anyway, so people have wondered, right? After a little bit of in the 50s and 60s, a social scientist watched this movie, or watched the musical movie, and said, well, wait a minute. It turns out that a lot of the characters and a lot of the plot kind of line up with this great deflation and its populism, right, or in its relationship to American populism in that 1870 to 1890 time period. And it turns out that you can map the characters of The Wizard of Oz quite tightly onto the whole, I guess, geopolitical situation at the time. So some of the symbolism here, people say that Dorothy, in her simplistic goodness, represents the American people, right, in this story. Scarecrow represents farming interests, right? The Tin Man is industry, and in particular the steel industry, right? And the Cowardly Lion, I've heard different takes on this. People sometimes, or one of the takes is that it represents the American military, which had just been financing a war, fighting the Spanish-American War, which wasn't a very proud moment in U.S. history, I would say. So what they all do is they all have these interests, right, that they're concerned about, and so they follow this yellow brick or gold road to Oz, right, which is the Emerald City. Everything is green. It's this fake world built on green paper money, right? So they all go there to meet the wizard, right, who turns out to, he comes off as being, he tries to be benevolent, and he says, oh, I'm really worried about, your well-being and all that, but he's actually quite selfish, right? But fools everyone. So this is kind of the Washington establishment in their feelings on money. So it turns out that problems are solved, right, when Dorothy puts on silver slippers, right? And you might think about that as returning to the bimetallic standard prior to the Coinage Act of 1873, right? Anything weird? Anybody notice anything about this in the movie version? Does my story here correspond with the movie version here? Not exactly, because look at the slippers that Dorothy's wearing. They're red, right? And in the movie, they're ruby slippers. Well, in the book, they're silver slippers. In the movie, they're red. And part of this just had to do with, making a movie. This is one of the first colorful films, right, ever made. And so they really wanted it to pop. And so, you could, the ruby red sparkling really was a nice visual effect there. So they changed the slippers. But in the book, it's a silver. So it's kind of interesting. There's a whole, if you want to look at political interpretations of the Wonderful Wizard of Oz here, there's actually, you can make it's an even deeper dive, So it's kind of an interesting thing to think about. The other thing I think about is I had friends who, when I was in college, they would maintain that, I think it was Pink Floyd, was it Dark Side of the Moon? I don't know if anybody even knows what that album is anymore. But they alleged that if you, I might have the album wrong, that if you synced it up and started it at an exact point of The Wizard of Oz, it was kind of perfectly synced with the rest of the movie. But I don't know. Never tried it. Okay, so that's a little preview of what we're trying to do here. But we're going to want to have, to develop a bit more of a detailed analysis of prices and overall economic performance, and think about a model that tells us something about how output, unemployment, and all of these things move together with inflation or price levels. And of course, we'll also want to think about money and interest rates. And so we're going to develop some moving parts and then put them all together again. We will probably have one more little foray into history. And this has to do with the fact that most of what we think of as macroeconomics really grew up during the Great Depression, right? Created by John Maynard Keynes, the foundations anyways. And his was a very financial theory, right? That is to say, what it did was it linked the fact that the stock market crashed at the beginning of the Depression, and then after that we had this period of deflation and high unemployment and all of these things. Okay, so to get there, we're just going to start piece by piece, building things up, and maybe develop things so we can think about most of what will follow here in terms of our old friends, supply and demand, right? Very first thing we're going to do is think about output prices paid by consumers. Instead of just talking about prices in general, we're going to break the world into prices and wages, right? Conceptually. So prices, that's stuff that you buy, that people buy, that, consumer goods, I guess you could say. Final goods, right? So maybe you're even picturing the circular flow and how we can calculate GDP by, thinking about expenditures on final goods. That's what we're talking about here, the prices we're talking about here. We're going to think about those prices, and we're going to separate out from those prices wages. I'll call them wages. But of course, wages is what is earned by labor. Not only am I going to think about wages as consisting of your salary, the money you make, all of that stuff, we're going to think about wages as sort of a catch-all term for all the inputs that firms buy, right? So inputs, what are these things? Whatever firms use to produce. This is labor, capital, land, raw materials. All of these things are what firms buy to produce. Why would we want to break the world into these two things? It's not so easy, by the way, in practice. So, for example, if you buy gasoline and drive somewhere, maybe you're a consumer, and that figures as a final good, right? But if you buy gasoline as part of your business, and you're a construction business or something, and you build a house, using gasoline, driving there and generators, whatever. One of those is an input, and one of those is a final good, right, or a good. So some gasoline then might be output price, and some might be wages. But we're going to break the world into these two categories, and we're going to proceed from there, and hopefully you'll understand why shortly. So, if we fix income and wages, right, we'll leave that aside for a second, coming back to that in a second, and we just think about output prices going up and down, right, we can think about things in terms of this curve here, which I've called AD, which is aggregate demand, right? So you have some amount of income, right, that comes from your wages and all that stuff, and of course profit income, rental income all goes to someone eventually, right? Those are all your sources of income. You fix that stuff and then you change prices up and down, right? Well, what we would get out of this is something very much like a demand curve. So here, I've actually interpreted our price index. Remember how we make those, right, in terms of 100. I've said that high values of the indices, well, that's like prices being high. That would seem to be like people, given their incomes, they would be unable to buy a lot of goods at these high prices, so they buy less. So that's a point like A, low demand, high prices, right? And as we go A, B, C, D, you can see here we just get this demand schedule saying given incomes, right, when the price of output goes up or down, well, so does the amount people purchase, right? So what we have is a mega demand curve, an aggregate demand curve, a demand curve for things in general, right? Now, maybe now you can start to realize why I was so careful about fixing income and wages and saying those things are fixed while the price of output changes. One of the reasons for this, more on this in a second, one of the reasons for this is that if that weren't the case, well, and say the price of oil goes up, well, what might happen is it might be that if you're a seller of oil, or you own a lot of shares in Exxon or something, that might cause Exxon to get very valuable, they pay you income, and now the price of oil is changing both incomes and what you're buying, right? That's not a problem that we have to worry about when we talk about a specific market, but in a macro sense we have to worry about that, right? When we change a price, it also impacts someone's income, so I've just kind of theoretically severed that link. And of course, this probably doesn't take a great sort of leap for you to realize. This is kind of like what people are talking about with inflation now, right? Everybody's saying, well, there's inflation, I can't afford to buy the groceries that I used to buy, right? And that's kind of, one way of thinking about what's going on here behind the scenes. Really just to highlight once again is that we think about the price as this price index, even though it really is this amalgamation of all prices. But one of the great things about that is we can now have a P and a Q, something like a Q, on our an aggregate demand diagram, right? So one of the things that we will do as we talk about theory and more, macroeconomic theory, is we like to think about this aggregate demand as actually coming from different places across the economy. John Maynard Keynes himself broke aggregate demand or spending. Not quite this simple, but this is, you take your macro Eco 200 or Eco 201 or Eco 301 and you deep dive into all of this stuff. John Maynard Keynes broke it down into three categories of aggregate demand. He says there's consumption, right? That's what you and I spend, more or less our typical spending, right? Groceries, whatever. That's C. Well, then there's this thing called I. That's investment expenditure, right? That's purchases by firms, right? In the interest of expanding their business, they buy final goods. not necessarily to make the product, right? They buy it to expand their capacity, a little bit different. And then there's G, that's what the government spends, right? And so we can say that aggregate demand consists of C plus I plus G, these three components of expenditure. Sometimes you add, this will happen when you take 201, you'll add in X minus IM. X is exports, and IM is imports, right? So you can, one thing that's happening here is you're saying, well, why do we suddenly have IM as imports? Well, we've been eating up all of our variables. We can't use I because it's already taken by investment, and M is taken up by money supply, so imports becomes IM. But sometimes you add in an international sector, and that's kind of a gateway to thinking about international macroeconomics, right? Which you would, you take a course in trade, Eco 340, or you take international finance, Eco 341, then you bring in that. But we're going to just typically assume that really C plus I plus G is all we need. So Keynes's idea, we're going to see, was that for aggregate demand, a lot of macroeconomic problems boil down to aggregate demand problems. That was his take. I, investment, is where these problems come from for aggregate demand, right? And this is part of thinking about the stock market crash prior to the Great Depression, right? It was the investment decisions of firms that kind of triggered all of this. So I is the source of the problem with aggregate demand, and then, of course, we can solve it using G, right? So a very nice little, if you're a mathematician, this is kind of, or a scientist, I guess you want to break the world into the simplest possible categories. That's kind of what he's done here. If I break things into C plus I plus G, that's about the simplest possible explanation I can get for what happened in the Great Depression. Anyways, I got a little bit ahead of myself there. We don't need to go that far. So this diagram has a supply curve. And since we've broken prices into output prices and input prices, the nice thing is we can now think about how firms' decisions vary with the price of output, fixing the price of inputs, right? Remember when we made a supply curve at the very beginning of class, we said, well, what things have to be fixed? Well, let's see here. We need to fix the price of inputs, the number of firms, the technology that firms use, all those things need to be fixed. So maybe now this is the other half of we don't want people's incomes changing as prices go up and down, the price of output. And we also don't want the supply function shifting around, at least not yet, right? So, we want to be able to draw a supply curve, I'll put it that way. That depends upon prices in general, and this is our overall output. Okay, so we were careful about separating our prices. And other than that, we basically now have demand and supply curves exactly as we've understood them all semester, right? We've just added the A in there, so now we understand that they're aggregate, right? That is to say they apply to the entire economy. There's going to be one other difference that I will caution you about, and that we're going to have to think about as we move through this part of the class. And that has to do with, there is this potential GDP out there, right? That is to say, there is some amount where we kind of bump up against it, and that's the most our economy can actually produce, right? We've talked about that, at some point, think about it this way, if we wanted to double or triple GDP today, we just don't have the people, the workers to do it, right? We run up against the constraints of our economy. That is a little bit different than any individual market, right, where we don't think about the world or a market as having that problem. When we think about things in aggregate, well, we have to say there is an eventual limit. And the way we might sort of characterize that is by, our supply curve will eventually get vertical, right? And then we can say, well, when it's almost vertical, that's about where potential is, right? And of course, you might think about this as unemployment equal its natural rate, right? At where the potential line is. Now, one thing that's nice about that is you can say, well, let's see, we can go above potential a little bit. That means everybody's working overtime, right? Jobs are all over the place. But, a little foreshadowing here, that'll have some consequences as we move forward. Okay, so all we have here is aggregate demand and aggregate supply. And so what determines the position of aggregate supply? Well, as I said, technology, the cost of inputs, our population, right? If we're thinking about the country in general, the amount of land we have, all those things. And of course, we can now, we'll have a different, I'll get to this in a second, we might think about the great deflation of the late 1800s just in these terms and see how it works in terms of our supply and demand diagram. But without further ado, we can put it all together and we get something like a macroeconomic equilibrium, and it's just where aggregate demand and aggregate supply intersect, right? And here, the nice thing about it here is now we just fill out the diagram, the story behind the diagram, we just fill it out using some more sophisticated terms here, right? So we can think about what a surplus and a shortage look like, just as we did in previous classes. So you might imagine that if the price level were 95, well, what happens here is that stuff is cheap, right? And firms aren't producing all that consumers in general want. So what should happen is, well, prices should start to go up. People buy a little bit less and firms produce a little bit more in general until we close the gap and get to the red dot there, right? So that's kind of the macroeconomic story, right? Maybe the other way is sort of the one you might think about. When prices are high, well, what should happen is now firms are producing much, their inventories are piling up, all of that stuff. What do? Well, they have to, prices start coming down, firms start lowering prices, they start depleting their inventories and all of that stuff. People start buying what's the extra stuff, and we're back at this red dot again. So you can see here we have kind of a nice macroeconomic story there. And in fact, macro isn't really my main field, but whenever anybody asks me about the macroeconomic situation, I almost always start by just drawing an aggregate demand and an aggregate supply and seeing where I can get with that, with a couple of bells and whistles, which we'll get to. Okay, so what then would we think about as changing demand in general, right? Remember, once again, we're not just talking about moving up and down a demand curve. We're talking about shifting the position of the demand curve, right? What sorts of things might change demand? Well, now we get some kind of interesting things that sound more macro-y, right, more financy. And you might say, well, consumer confidence is one thing that might change demand. So when consumers feel really good about the economy, you can say, well, I think things are good today, things are going to be good for my business in the future, I will go buy that car or that extra guitar or whatever it is I want to buy, I'll go buy that today, right? It makes you more likely to buy things at any given price, so that should shift the aggregate demand curve out. We'll do some of this on the overhead in a second. So this applies to consumers and to firms, right? Firms say, well, let's see, when I think the future is going to be good, maybe it's a good time then to expand my business today, right? So I will go out and, I'll buy a couple new vehicles for my fleet. I'll buy, a new building, whatever, right? I'm getting a little close to spending on inputs, but okay. And of course, one thing that's interesting about macro is now you can kind of think a little bit about how these things are intersewn with borrowing, right? Oftentimes you sort of say, well, you know what, things are good today, I think they'll be good in the future, I think my business will continue to make money, I'll be doing well, I can take out a loan and buy a car today, right? That's another way, these forward-looking purchases depend a little bit on your, on what you think the future is going to look like. Of course, so there's things like that. There's also stuff about policy that can influence aggregate demand, right? And so maybe now you're beginning to think about how we might manage the economy if we were policymakers. So we usually break policy into two categories, fiscal policy and monetary policy. Fiscal policy are things that the government does that change spending and change taxation. So they have to do with the amount of money that consumers have and the amount of money the government is actually spending, right? So if we wanted to make aggregate demand larger, what we could do if we were the government is we could buy more stuff. That is to say, we could increase spending on things, right? Alternatively, if we wanted to, if we wanted to reduce aggregate demand, one thing we might do to do that is, well, we could lower the amount we're spending as a government. We could also increase taxes, right? That influences the demand that consumers have. If you take more money from consumers, well, they don't have as much to spend, right? Income, put another way, doesn't translate into spending as readily as it once did. So we're going to think about that mainly as we get going. Monetary policy is a little bit more complicated, but maybe, in my experience, a little bit more interesting from the perspective of students. Essentially what happens here is you fiddle around with interest rates, like the Federal Reserve changes its prime rate, or the quantity of cash in circulation. You do these things, and this actually can increase or decrease demand as well, right? How that works, we'll leave that aside for now because it's a little bit more nuanced, but fun to talk about. So if we wanted to think of, well, why don't we just test drive our model here and see if it kind of does some things that we want. So let's see, I have technological change, confidence, oil price shocks, new wage laws, booming stock market, so on and so forth. So let me see here. Technical change. Actually, you know what I'm going to do is I'm just going to write those down quickly so I don't have to bounce back and forth. So let's see. Change in T, confidence, oil, wage. I'm trying to be a little provocative with some of these too. Stock, government, expenditures. Okay, so I have 5 things I just wanted to do here. So let's see here. All right, the first thing we wanted to think about was how things change when there's technological progress, right? So what we might do here is we might draw out our aggregate demand here. Maybe I'll call this Y, right, for national income. You might say, well, or output. You might say I could use Q. I guess I could use Q as the quantity of stuff we produced. We often use Y because it's a, income equals output thing. We can't use I because we've allocated that to investment, right? So that's why we go with Y here for income. Pretty common in economics. And then we have the price level here. I'll just call that P. But you might think about this as a consumer price index, right? It's overall index value. So in some year it equals 100. We draw out our aggregate demand, draw out our aggregate supply like this, and we start with some equilibrium here. And there's a whole bunch of things I'm not thinking about or I haven't put on here. We're just trying to get a feel for what this looks like and if we can get some semblance of a grip on these macroeconomic problems I was thinking about. So a change in technology, right? This might be something like what happened in the Great Deflation at the end of the century there. It might just be something that's ongoing in the economy. Well, when technology gets better, that means firms can produce more at every price than they could before, right? Better technology. We might think about that as a shift out in the aggregate supply curve. Well, what does this predict should happen in our macro economy? Well, you can see here we would expect that prices go down and output goes up, right? Prices down and overall output goes up. And that seems to be kind of in line with what was going on during that deflationary period at the end of the century, right? Output was expanding, there's all these technological discoveries, and coincident with that were falling prices, right? So that, our quantity theory, I guess, gave it that, but now we have, some of the machinations behind the scenes a little bit more clearly exposited. Okay, what do I have next here? Consumer confidence. Okay, well, what might that do? Let's draw it all out again. I have aggregate demand, aggregate supply, put Y, P, right? Now I've sort of subsumed those things I mentioned before. Okay, consumer confidence is booming. That would mean that we expect aggregate demand would increase, and so if we're starting off at this point where here's output and here's prices, an increase in consumer confidence, well, that should cause output to go up, right? Firms produce more and all that stuff, but at the same time it might cause prices to go up. We would understand this as sort of growing GDP, right? Low unemployment maybe as well, right? And we would understand this to mean some inflation is going on because prices are increasing, right? Okay. Well, what about another test case here? What if we think about, here's aggregate demand, here's aggregate supply again, Y, P. My next question was about oil, and I will treat oil here as an input in production. So this is, whenever I mention this, I think back to the 1970s where we had a series of oil crunches, and the price of oil went way up, right? The supply was restricted at the same time its price went up. And you can think about oil here as being an important input in the production process. So when the price of an input changes and goes up, you would say, well, this makes it harder for suppliers to supply goods in general. So this increase in this price of an input, right, we might expect to shift back aggregate supply. And you can see here, well, what do we get out of this? Falling output and rising prices. Now, if you're an economist and you're in Washington working on such problems, this is the worst case scenario, right? Because now you have falling output, high unemployment, at the same time you have inflation, right? This supply shock, or oil shock, if you want to think about it, has done that, and this is maybe the worst case scenario if you're a policymaker. In fact, it very closely approximates what happened in the 70s, right? With some other things. Interestingly, or maybe not interestingly, I have this example where what happens if wages increase? Well, that's a little bit more complicated, right? So maybe we pass a new law that says that now all firms have to pay overtime whenever anybody works more than 30 hours, right? Well, this kind of can do a couple of things, I guess. You could say, well, let's see, it might shift aggregate demand somehow, right? And this is one thing that makes macro a little bit complicated. You could say, well, if wages go up, right, that means that people have more money to spend, and that would increase their aggregate demand. But then there's another side to that coin, right? If wages go up, that means that maybe firms are paying more out in wages, so maybe their bottom line is hurt, and so their profits become income for someone too. So some parts of income are going up and some are going down, right? So we don't really know what happens to aggregate demand in that case. And of course, there's also the case that we have to think about labor in general, right? So if we raise the cost of labor, maybe some people are fired, right? And so maybe income goes down. So it gets a little confusing there. We can, however, say that aggregate supply should shift back as a result of this change, right? That is to say, if we make labor more expensive, well, then aggregate supply should shift back, and that can cause something approximating this. Now, what I just said, I deliberately said it to be. I see some people looking at me kind of funny. That's good, because we're going to want to think about these things, everything I just said there, deeply, right? And we're going to want to think about what the macro aspects of these policies are as we move forward here. A booming stock market. Well, if the stock market is doing really well, that seems like it would, reflect be higher incomes for everybody, right? People get paid dividends and all of that stuff, and that might then shift out aggregate demand, much like this. So it might cause, at least in this diagram, we get a simple prediction here that, well, things can be really good when the stock market's booming, but since it's manifest as higher aggregate demand, that might also mean some inflation occurs, right? And so you've probably heard things like this, both about consumer confidence and the market and all that. Ooh, things are booming, things are great. The Fed is worried, the policymakers, the Fed, the government, they're worried about the economy overheating, right? So here we are, back to the ideal gas law, and thinking about what happens when there's more pressure right, apply to the economy? Well, the tendency is for the price level to go up, right, when incomes go up. So that's kind of what they're saying when they're saying the economy is overheating. The last one I have, of course, is government expenditure. And so how might that work? Well, we just said that that was a component of aggregate demand. So we can draw it all out here. Now we shift out aggregate demand here because government expenditure goes up. We can see that, well, what happens is prices should go up and incomes should go up. So that is constantly or often a worry, right? That you can get higher output out of the economy by spending more as a government, but you might also cause some inflation in prices. So one thing that's kind of interesting here is some of this inflation, right, is price increases caused by shifting the curves around. But in some sense, this aggregate supply curve I shifted was the product of a particular type of inflation, which was input price inflation. So you often hear economists talk about wages and how they're changing differently than prices and how inflation and how that's working. And maybe you can begin to see how this works. So that's a quick test drive of our model. Seems like it, at least, superficially it's working okay. We're going to have to add in some bells and whistles to make that model really work and to get a really good understanding as to how the macroeconomy is working. And we're going to do this next time, and we're going to think about the role for policy here. Of course, I'll see you in a week, and have a good Thanksgiving. And you might, if you want to just take a look at this little link I put here in the notes, it's all about the cost of Thanksgiving, and here we have a Thanksgiving dinner index, right, cost for you to contemplate. So I will see you in a week.
Have you been to the-
You too.